So you get two, but you don't necessarily get multiple in every domain of phrases. And so perhaps the real trigger of recursion, the real sign of recursion, is when you can do more than two, because you could just have an idiom form prior to that. So a question that we asked is, are children's complements recursive? Our goal was to determine whether children have acquired the structural properties of complementation, namely syntactic embedding, and we began by investigating recursive syntactic embedding. And this is a quote from Hollebrands and Van Hout, who also addressed this question recently in 2013. They said, for sentences with one level of embedding, it's possible the construction is formed with an actual recursive rule that combines, or in technical terms, merges the main verb with an embedded clause, which is what I've been assuming, but it's alternatively possible that in some non-target-like way, e.g. as two coordinated main clauses or with some form of adjunction structure, it could appear to be a complement, but it isn't really. It might be the first form the children get. So what we want to do is look for things that have multiple embedded. These are just more examples of multiple forms. This was one of my favorite. Imagine you're a visitor to Heathrow Airport and you're trying to read this sign as you go past, right? Heathrow Airport, visitor long-term car park courtesy shuttle bus stop. Okay, that's an example of the absurd ways that English compounds nouns. All right, so what particular use is recursion? Maybe syntactic recursion might play a role in the representation of the propositional attitudes. And as I've said before, propositional attitudes require a medium that's as rich as language provides. And in particular, truth shifts, I've argued, is an essential property that makes complement structures ideally suited for false belief representation. And so I'm attached to this idea that it's all about falsity, maybe not so much about recursion. Okay. Oh yeah, I need to say this. Okay. What if a language, say, piraha, that's the wrong diacritic across the A, I have no idea how to get that little swirly thing on the Mac, sorry. What if a language like this Amazonian language, piraha, lacked recursion? Could the same effect be achieved over a series of sentences? Could a series of single sentences represent the fact that one individual knows one thing and another individual knows something different? So we explored this in English, and of course that might not be the right language to explore it in, but let me share it. Whoa. That's interesting. Okay, let me try and read it. The soup is hot. Eric knows that. Two short sentences. Eric knows that the soup is hot. You can easily draw that conclusion. That refers back to that first proposition. You can do it without a complement. I just said to you, the soup is hot. Eric knows that. Fine. Well, I hope this next one isn't as bad. Oh dear. Okay. First order, the soup is hot. Eric knows that. Eric knows that the soup is hot. How about the soup is hot? Eric's sister doesn't think that. It's another first order. So Eric's sister doesn't think that the soup is hot. Let's try second order, done by discourse. The soup is hot. Eric knows that. His sister doesn't think that. The reading I'm looking for is the embedded one. Eric's sister doesn't think that Eric knows that the soup is hot. Not the simple one where the sister has one view of the soup and Eric has another view of the soup. And the question is, can one get that reading from a series of sentences? So we found a way to ask children that question by giving these two variants. In version A, we said, will his sister blow on the soup? If the answer is no, then the children believe that his sister doesn't think the soup is hot. But if they answer yes, then they are treating it as his sister doesn't think that Eric knows that the soup is hot, but she knows that the soup is hot, therefore she will blow on it. So by just saying, will his sister blow on the soup, we determine whether the child has a first-order interpretation of the sentences going through, or an embedded interpretation, two-version embedded. Or we ask version B, will his sister tell Eric to blow on the soup? If the child says no, then it means his sister doesn't think that the soup is hot. Or if the child says yes, then again, it's an embedded interpretation. So we had two kinds of questions that we asked, and the results are as follows. Basically, nobody gives an embedded interpretation in the discourse condition. They either give the non-embedded, these are children, the non-embedded interpretation, or they say something totally irrelevant, like I would if I were her, or no, not even that. I would because I don't like hot soup or something like that. So the why answers, when we ask why, this is the reason we distinguish between the bars, and the result was nobody allowed second order embedding over discourse. So in English, how to put it? The second order complement gives a way of representing a truth that the discourse version does not. The deeper question is, in a language that lacks recursive sentences, does the discourse version suffice? And that's an answer I don't have for you, but it suggests a manner of asking that in one of these other languages that lacks it. We have the habit of using recursive complementation. Perhaps it's just a habit. Perhaps it could be represented another way if the language had a different form. I would say it's possible to express the semantics of belief ascription without syntactic complementation, but only at the first order level in English. In order to respond to a second order belief, to report a second order belief, a belief about a belief, you need a double embedded structure, and the same applies for verbs of saying. I'm going to skip a bit of this because I think I would rather have time for question. We have given we've given a variety of different tests to children of both second order belief and second order complementation, in the hope that we could find that second order complements were prerequisite for second order belief understanding. We have, as far as the present, failed to prove that conjecture. So we've meddled with all kinds of varieties, and as I say, it's disturbing for the strong linguistic determinism theory that recursive complementation is needed to represent recursive false beliefs. It certainly is the case that we don't find single complementation automatically leads to recursive complementation. The children are 7 and 8 before they understand recursive complementation. There's some other ingredient needed, which might suggest that single order complements are not recursive in themselves. Or it might suggest other factors like memory might be, getting in the way in testing second order complementation. We do find that children are better in some studies at second order false beliefs than at second order complementation. But the result reverses for another task. So we don't know whether, which task to believe. I'll show you a little bit of the difference between them. The one that showed better results, this is the counterintuitive one. We did a study where we just looked at recursive complements, but they didn't involve a truth change. They involved a personal attitude change. So here's the example. Billy is talking to Jane. Mom is cleaning up. Billy tells Jane that Mom said that comic books are stupid. What did Billy tell Jane? And the question is, would children say, comic books are stupid, which is not something Billy would say, or do they understand that Billy said, Mom says comic books are stupid? Now the problem is that task sort of requires you to produce complex form, and also there may be some confusion in the story about whether he believes that as well, whether it's one of these types like Packard and Litz and Lewis are talking about. That is it really true that Billy's beliefs are different? In this particular case, children were not able to answer these questions, even though they were relatively able on a second-order false belief task. So in a later variety, sorry about this, in a later variety we actually tried varying truth, but these are so hard. The woman called the police and said she found a cat in her backpack. What, said the police officer? A woman said she found a cat in her backpack. That's crazy, I bet she found a scarf. Look, it was really a stuffed animal. What did the woman say she found? What did the policeman say the woman said she found? I mean, it just, you know, they're so hard. And what we found in that case is that mastering second-order beliefs was a little bit ahead of mastering second-order complementation was a little bit ahead of mastering second-order beliefs. So the result comes and goes, and we haven't yet managed to find the right measure of both. I would like to argue that truth contrasts are critical triggers of sentence recursion, and so you ought to get an understanding of truth contrasts, then sentence recursion, then false belief recursion. But because the second-order tasks entail so many other skills, like short-term memory and so forth, we have not yet found a satisfactory test. So I'm going to leave it there rather than go into the nasty details and leave 10 minutes for questions.
All right, it's a small room, but we have a microphone if anyone needs it.
Really, we still have a lot of questions, but I would try to go last one. I'm just wondering about the test that with soup. That's the latest question I had. So it seems to really be also about what we choose that to be what it takes as anaphor, like which one.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
So so it could be just really a really strong choice at that level, rather than inability or just a preference in a sense. So to what extent have you tried to like you could have had even explicitly say that exclude the options, whatever Jim likes the things that doesn't, the soap is hot, Jim doesn't know that, Mary, his sister knows it, but the soup is hot, John's sister knows it, John doesn't know it, John doesn't know it, and then again something like his sister knows that, something like that. I'm trying to say that to actually help, that was first came to my mind, but like the other ways to kind of help them, exclude or at least prefer the embedded. Just wondering to what extent it's an inability to, or the non-existence of that structure rather than just in this specific context, just a clear preference of where and for what is that choosing.
I think I see, but we chose that because it can, take a whole sentence as its reference. And I suppose it could as well. I mean, we've done this with adults, obviously, first, and our adults couldn't get the embedding either. So it wasn't just a fact about the children. But, I'm still stuck on this question of, well, so, because we have another means to do it in English, does that mean that all languages would, fail to understand?
But again, my question was, you are interpreting the result as adults or children cannot get
Cannot
it.
do
While
it,
I'm
right.
asking, is it just a strong
A
preference
preference,
in
right.
an ambiguous
That's
case,
always,
anaphoric, which
right.
is, and so what you need to construct are
Mhm.
cases where you disambiguate or you kind of give a strong, you weight, you know, the preference, but then you see whether you still, then adults would get it, because I mean, I created a scenario for myself, now I cannot repeat it myself in my head, but where I would much more easily get the embedded one as an adult, non-native speaker, but I assume natives will do the same, so I'm just wondering, in that case with children, still will not, even if you strongly...
Even if you make a strong pragmatic
my
bias
preference
towards the
bias
other
words, and
alternative, yeah.
that you would get it, that's like one.
That's an interesting idea, and we thought the story kind of set it up to be either alternative, especially in the light of the question, you know, will she blow on the soup or will she... We had another one about crossing a bridge where if the bridge was broken, you know, the guy would fall in the water, and you wanted to stop the person from crossing the bridge so they wouldn't drown. You know, I mean,
but it's the question level already. I mean, I don't want to take a lot of time to
yeah, no,
talk about later.
thank you. You've given me something to think about. Is there a way to bias it towards the embedded reading, and would you then show that it's just a preference? In this particular case, it's biased towards the non-recursive embedding. Thanks.
And there's something I would like to make sure to have correctly understood. I was very interested about the children that grew up in poor environments, and that way they didn't learn the language standard. And I was recalling what I've heard about Basil Bernstein and his theory about the deficit hypothesis and how it has been, to some extent, proven wrong. And I wanted to ask you what I've learned about it is that basically the deficit hypothesis has been proven wrong as to the descriptive powers and also in older children. But can it be? Has it been confirmed in as far as the the representative powers in younger children have really been impaired by deficitary learning of the language?
Yeah, it's a very hot topic in America right now because of this work by Hart and Risley in 1995, which has come back to haunt us in the form of the 30 million word gap. So what Hart and Risley did in a very small study in 1995 was to take children who were either from low-income families, and I think they were all on welfare actually, and most of them were black, and then a group of middle-income families, and they followed them for a year and recorded some fairly frequent interactions between the child and the parent. And on the basis of that year's worth of data, maybe it was longer, they projected how many more words the middle-class children would hear by the time they were 5, let's say, entering school. And what they projected was that they would hear 30 million fewer words than the low-income kids. And this has spiraled into a little industry in the United States where a great many people, including the Clintons, are on this bandwagon of trying to solve the problem of the 30 million word gap and its implications for the achievement gap between low-income kids and middle-income kids. And it's a political hot potato because it strikes me as a form of blaming the victim. There are plenty of reasons why a child in poverty might need some assistance, but getting the mother to say more words to the child seems to me more like a band-aid than anything else. And also it's focused on words, and as far as I know, no linguist would say it's the number of words you know that makes you a human. So I think it's misguided in its direction, and I think it's worrying in its political implications. But I don't know how many of you have heard, perhaps you all have investments in, the Lena Foundation, which is actually, this device was produced by well-meaning psychologists and psycholinguists. It's a recording device that you attach to the child, and the city of Providence has bought many thousands of these to attach to poor kids, so that the number of words or the number of sound bursts that the child hears addressed to them during the course of a day can be evaluated, sent to a central system, and the parent can be informed that they need to speak more to their child. It's it's quite scary. And those of us who lived through the Bernstein era, you know, have shocks of recollection of this kind of attitude. I mean, in the meantime, you know, in the 1990s, I worked on this assessment test for children who speak African American English because, as you might know, as you might guess, these are usually the recipients of this horror story about how incomplete their language is and how deficited their input is and so on. And we, you know, I and my co-authors, Tom Roper and Harry Seymour, produced an assessment test called the Delve, which we designed to remove the bias that was about standard English and assess the deeper aspects of language and grammar that should be true of children no matter what variety of English they're being exposed to. So I was very much, you know, in that field for 15 years developing this assessment test, and I'm sort of horrified that this 30 million word gap has kind of taken over attention, and yet, you know, people are still assessing kids with the same old tests that don't take account of dialect and cultural variation. Is that something of an answer?
Yes, did those children like acquire something like false belief recursion later because of the different variety?
Well, no. In the study that I mentioned, the big study, they were all low-income kids, and they're getting theory of mind understanding at around 4.5 or 5, so it might be a little later than your average middle-class kid who might get it in the early 4s. So we haven't seen any profound deficits in those kids. Second-order recursion, Holobrandts has just done it with what seem to be middle-class kids in Holland, and they're not getting it until 7 or 8. Our kids were getting some of it at 6, so you know that's much less determinate. But I don't see any evidence that there's profound delay in recursion.
Thank God.
Even with 30 million fewer words. Yes, David.
Can I ask you one?
Doesn't seem to be.
Yes. Can I ask you about whether you take the analysis that you and Tom have of movement of tense to comp of the embedded the complement as an argument about the reality of all of those levels of structure, or do you take it as simply a way of describing the data in terms of a theory that needs separate justification?
Ooh, too deep.
Well, I mean,
Yeah. No, I mean,
one way to read
yeah.
that is the way people have taken a lot of psycholinguistic or sometimes neurological evidence as evidence for a particular representation of sentence structure, namely one with all these abstract, called them markers on the top of sentences. But the alternative is just to say, well, you know, you have a notion of phases, and you know, theory has a notion of phases and has a notion of the structure of these categories, and I can describe the observed data about children's answering questions about tensed and non-tensed complements in terms of elements of that theory, but I don't need that theory. All I have to do is say that tensed complements are opaque and untensed complements are not.
So you're asking, am I Copernicus or Galileo? Right? Because Copernicus, in the beginning of his astronomy work, said, it's as if
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah.
The Earth moved around the sun and hence escaped the Inquisition, right?
Yeah.
So I would like to believe that although the theory isn't finished, that we should take these theoretical entities as serious contenders for what might be in the mind of a child. And, you know, they're going to change with the decade, and that doesn't particularly bother me. We're trying to do the best description we can. I don't see the value of thinking of them as separate theoretical entities that don't really describe what's going on. I think we should pursue the idea that they are real in the mind of the child and then discover where they fail. Does that help?
I'm going to interpret that as saying that you think this is evidence for the existence of those categories.
I do, yeah.
question actually down relates also to the earlier questions about vocabulary. I mean, in the model, in the structural equation model that you showed, you highlighted the importance of the complement.
No, but vocabulary.
But the vocabulary was actually, numerically at least, in both was significant, but in both first, if I'm correctly remembering the graphs, which were quite complex, both in the first and the second stages, vocabulary was actually a stronger predictor, and it was a direct predictor. So I'm just wondering, and this relates to me, I mean, and I for a long time was thinking about theory of mind and kind of following up on your thoughts, which I found as a syntactician very appealing to kind of think of it as a structural property that kind of allows for the emergence of the representation of these mental representations. But then seeing this work and seeing the work on that I think you mentioned yesterday on Nicaraguan Sign Language kind of suggested there's a strong lexical component to this theory of mind ability. So there's really that you need to master a certain lexical item. So I wonder how are those, like how these two things fit together, given also now, which I did not know of your data or the structural equation, which really shows importance for vocabulary, of course, in some kind of a very general term. I assume. To what extent did you think about it?
It's a very good question. We had found this result before with deaf kids, that vocabulary was as important as sentential complements. And in that line of work we had a way of thinking about it in which vocabulary was kind of a proxy for how much language the child had, you know, in general. And I'm still inclined to, given that there's no theoretical argument in favor of vocabulary being predictive, I still think of it as kind of a proxy of how much exposure to conversation the child has had. And conversation will inevitably expose you to complementation, of which the complement test is but a tiny and possibly flawed index of how much the child knows about embedding. Do you see my reasoning? So the complement test is not ideal. I mean, one would like to get rid of the WH part of it and, you know, get rid of the memory requirements and so forth. One would like a real measure of how much the child understands embedding. But instead we've got this little one-shot version. The vocabulary test is a much richer proxy for how much exposure to language the child has had. And given that we don't have a theoretical reason to argue that the more vocabulary you know, the better you ought to be at theory of mind, and I've tried to show that vocabulary and all these devices in conversation aren't going to be enough in the absence of complementation, I'm inclined to treat it that way and not think of it as a rival alternative to the complement story. But I could be dead wrong. Somebody could come up with a good theory about why it matters that you have a rich vocabulary to succeed in theory of mind tasks.
So, unfortunately, I don't remember it's been a while since I read the series up to a few papers from the group who was working with the Nicaraguan Sign Language, so I'm talking from old memories, but if I remember correctly, for theory of mind, and I think, and I'm pretty sure for navigation, where I better remember of the paper, they actually found that when they retested, the same people a few years later,
They did.
and that when what they actually succeeded in those tasks, and what was seemed to be changed is that these first generation cohort were actually kind of acquired, or at least were using now for the first time this kind of left-right for the orientation and some embedding verbs. So there seemed to be a relation, a very specific, but not a general about vocabulary. That's why I said, would a possible direct hypothesis kind of going to explain the Nicaraguan data, and then also maybe a more specific version of the vocabulary of your data, which would be interesting to test, is the specific knowledge of particular lexical items. So that should be an interesting and very, not deep theory, but just say, once you know the verb and believe, then you know, when you learn that concept, you produce it, and then you can actually represent it. I know it's not very interesting, but
No, I think it is an important point, because there are these three levels. So there's the think about, which is what children get fairly early. They understand that you can have a mental content that is a thing. And then there's the forward going, you know, I think to do something, although it's not really well represented by the verb think. But I hope, I want. And then there's the one that has the full propositional attitude with the tense. And you have to sort those verbs out and figure out which one means which, absolutely. And you have to sort out verbs of communication. You have to understand that these verbs of mental state are referring to inner states. So there's a lot of particular knowledge in addition to the complements that you need to get, which could be represented by this crude measure of how many words you know. That's the kind of thing I mean by saying it's a proxy for how much other experience the child have that might lead to this knowledge of complementation. But it's absolutely worth exploring. Yes.
So kind of following up on this, in addition to the complement, and something you said already is the tense of the embedded clause, but in general their tense is pretty bad. So my son, he might have seen 2.5-year-old running around. Everything that's in the past tense is yesterday. So it could have happened earlier today, and that's yesterday I did this. So in general in these tasks, I wonder if they can even, if they're just so focused on the presence of the present right now, of where that ball is, or where that bear is, rather, and thinking that's all that's relevant, and not fully comprehending what is being asked of them. Maybe they have a representation of that other person's belief, but they're so focused on the present tense, and they can't even really fully understand. Well, I don't know, my son might be abnormal or whatever, but they have a problem understanding tense in general, so they use an adverbial to mark it. If I pick him up from nursery and say, am I going to nursery today? Well, I already picked you up. I don't sometimes I really have to generate a new language to understand them.
Yes, I see what you mean. So that's another ingredient in understanding that tense refers to past. And interestingly, in a lot of cases, it's really immediate past. It's almost like a tense agreement. You know, what did she say she ate? It's just happened, right? It's not like you have to refer to yesterday.
Yeah.
So I don't know the extent to which there's really a conceptual difficulty with that, but I agree with you. Making the distinction between a non-finite clause and a finite clause matters hugely in our story. And if they don't have the marker for tense that indicates that, then the difference between those two clauses is going to escape their attention for a long time. And you're right, you know, children have some difficulty.
I mean, there's a
tense
correlation
markers.
between their temporal processing in general and tense processing.
Right.
So, like, if you say, we will buy you an ice cream this afternoon, it's like, I'm
Yeah.
getting it now. Like, there's
Right.
no way to delay that expectation.
Yes. Yes.
So there's,
Ice cream.
So you're really talking about two ingredients.
Two
You're talking about
ingredients that
ingredients of impulse control and
Yes.
you know, wanting everything in the
but in
present.
general, temporal processing, they have trouble
But
with
yes.
that. Then they're kind of focused on.
Absolutely, all of those are ingredients in why there's a lag in the
Well, they have a really hard, it's really hard for them to think about the future. Like if I say, we will do this, and, you know, he can't think about weeks, he can't think about days. We're going to the south of France, we're going to go to the beach. And if I say the next day, we're going on the train, oh, we're going to France. Oh, no, today we're just going to downtown London. They have no concept for timing, and they're constantly, it seems, in the now. So I just wonder if they get focused on where things are right
But
now.
The reason I have a little bit of an objection to that view of children is that one of the first words they learn is want,
Yeah.
and it's in reference to an absent object.
Mm,
So it's really not the case that children only talk about what's in front of them.
yeah,
They talk about missing things. I want X, and X isn't in front of them.
yeah,
So they actually have quite an abstract understanding of the world.
yeah,
But I agree with you that tense is hard to get.
yeah.
And there are all kinds of complicated rules, like, you know, the tense in an embedded clause has its agreement relation with the top clause, even though it might refer to some different time. He said he was reading the newspaper. You use the past tense for both clauses, but in fact, at the time he said it, he was actually reading the newspaper. So why isn't it he said, I am reading the newspaper, right? Which is what you have to do in a language like Japanese that doesn't have tense agreement. So, you know, there's a lot of things to learn about tense and complements, and it's why it doesn't surprise me that this stuff takes a little while to get. We will have lunch now.
Where's my lunch then? Where's my lunch now?